Hi. Just waiting for some people to pop on. Hi. How are you? I don't know who you are, but I know there's one person watching. Two! Hey! I've decided not to keep asking for hearts and things for whether you can hear me, because I'm assuming that you'll just let me know if there's if it's a matter of you can't hear me talking, then you'll just put a message up. We'll wait for a minute or so for any others to join us. Keeps bobbing in between numbers, so I'm assuming that people click on to see who's doing the Sanctuary Matrix, see it's me, and then go away. Hiya John, how's it going? Ever faithful. Wait another minute or so, and then we'll get going. Today we're going to be looking at good morning, the stories of Deborah, Gideon, and Samson, but with the background of the Book of Judges, and I would imagine that this will probably take 2 weeks. Need to speak to you private. Okay, folks. Brilliant stuff. I'll try giving you a ring later on. We'll also go into the book of Ruth next time, but there's a lot to get through with the book of Judges, and we'll start now. Well, the book of Judges is essentially a history book. The Bible covers the entire history of the world from before the world began until its end, and it's the only book of its kind that does that. It's certainly the only religious book that does that. The earliest part of the Bible and the last book of the Bible are either divine inspiration or human imagination, and you have to decide, and that's where faith comes in. The book of Judges is the second book in the Nevi'im, prophets, for want of a better word, the second section of the Tanakh in the Hebrew Bible. It is considered part of the Deuteronomic history, Deuteronomy, and then some. Uh, that begins in the last book of the Torah, which ends in the second book of Kings. These books tell of the Israelites' reign over the land of Canaan, and have a heavy focus on divine reward and punishment. Sorry, I had to lean to my left because there was a chair sticking in my leg. But essentially the book of Judges is a history book. Judges begins shortly after Joshua's death and continues until Samuel's birth. Looking at the text itself and the various tribes of whom the stories are focused, this is evidence that the book is composed from several sources. Because each of the major judges comes from a different tribe of Israel, each with its own traditions, scholars theorize that these stories were originally separate stories and regional texts, and they've been combined together at a later date. It's likely also that traditional passages were added into this text, including short accounts of the minor judges, basically to link the stories together. There are 4 levels of studying history. Personalities, being the personalities who make history happen, the great figures in history. The peoples, as in the peoples and their nations. The patterns, rhythms in history, cycles of recession and economic growth. There have been 21 civilizations that have come about so far, and they all follow a similar pattern. And the purpose of this history, is it a matter of patterns, or is there a specific purpose for us being here? There are people who say that there is no purpose in history. We are just going around in circles, and history repeats itself. This is a human viewpoint of history. But the divine view of history is that it's a linear rather than cyclical. In other words, history is going somewhere. So the human viewpoint is history's just repeating itself, and the divine viewpoint is history is going somewhere, and it's got an eventual end and a goal. It's travelling from the past through the present to the future, and God is moving history to his ending. Therefore, it's his story, as in history. I'd like to take an aside for this for the moment. A lot of people look at the things that I'm saying and the studies that I've done, and they're amazed at for want of a better word, the knowledge. It's I'm no great theologian. It's all effectively pinched from people. It's just a matter of the way I put it together. So I don't want anybody to think that I'm anything special. You can all get this all this information from wherever you're looking at it. It's just a matter of knowing where to look and discovering things from different viewpoints. But all this information is out there. There's nothing new in the world. There's nothing revelationary that I'm saying, but it's a good starting point, and it's a good place to get a grip on things and to have a look at specific people. Right, I've said that. Now I'm going to carry on. In the book of Judges, the people were not following the law of Moses. Their lives had got away from following God, and let the Holy Spirit guide you. That's what I do. I always pray beforehand that the words that come out of my mouth are the Holy Spirit's words, and that's all that I can do. Because I never want to influence you with regards to my theories and my viewpoints. I just want to effectively tell a story. Their lives had got away from them, from following God, and are just going round and round rather than going forward. So is life a circle or a line? For you, it depends on whether you are in tune with God. If you find yourself going in circles, then maybe you need to reflect on God more. Redemption puts you onto a royal line, which is fulfilling God's purpose, such as in the book of Ruth, which we'll eventually get onto. You're part of a purpose which is being worked out. Originally, the book of Judges and Ruth were the same book, and that's one of the reasons why I'm taking Judges and Ruth together, and still one book in the Hebrew Bible. One of the things that I find useful is referring to rabbis and Jewish teachers on certain parts of the Old Testament. You can't do it in the New Testament because they don't believe in the New Testament, but unless they're Messianic Jews. But it's good to get a different viewpoint and a viewpoint from their perspective. Who wrote this book and why? And even though the answers are not given in either book, we can answer these questions, and we'll probably answer them in the next section. Most people only have a Sunday school knowledge of the book of Judges, and you can't really teach Judges in Sunday school because it's full of prostitutes chopping up women and various other really horrendous things. And there's a lot of people that ask, what's all this monstrosity doing in the Bible? Well, the Bible takes things and acts of real people, and real people do some horrendous things, and it shows us that this isn't just a guided tour of the niceties of life. This is real grit and real life. And when you cut out the bad bits, you only know about the personalities. The stories were remembered, then repeated, then recorded. Well, of the heroes and personalities in the book of Judges, it's quite unbalanced. Samson has 4 chapters. Gideon has 3, and some of the other judges only get a slight mention. It seems the more sensational they were, the bigger the mention. And it's almost a tabloid newspaper as basically written the book of Judges. All the sensational things that happened are detailed in every bit of their gore and simplicity. But it's quite a weird sort of viewpoint. And Deborah and Barak have quite a bit in there as well. And the first impression is that it is just a story of folk heroes. And we'll work through the book of Judges now. The first judge we come across is Othniel ben Kenazar, who's Caleb's younger brother. The earliest judge fights and defeats the king of Aram. Under Othniel, Israel has 40 years of peace until his death. He is the only judge mentioned who is connected with the tribe of Judah. Ehud is a very colourful character. Ehud ben Gera from the tribe of Benjamin. Following shortly after Othniel, he was a left-handed guy, and he carried his 18-inch sword strapped to his right leg, because when people frisked people, when guards would frisk people, they would assume that they were right-handed and only frisk the left leg. And Ehud concealed his weapon on his right leg. He is called upon by God to end an 18-year oppression by Eglon, king of Moab. It's a rather notorious story. Ehud tricks his way into the abyss, Eglon's chamber, by saying he has a secret message for the king. And when allowed in close, he's at this point he's asked all Ehud's men to exit the chamber, because he's got this secret message that he wants to pass on to Eglon. And when allowed in close, Ehud says, "I have a message for you from God," and it's a very private message. And when everybody was out of the room, Ehud takes out his sword and plunges his sword into the king's belly. Now, the king was really fat. I mean, obesely fat. And he was so fat that the fat closed around Ehud's hand. It engulfed this 18-inch sword and Ehud's hand. So you can imagine being that far up in somebody's belly. and Ehud kills the king. Then, having killed him, he went out and told the king's guards that he's gone to relieve himself. He's gone to the poo. And give him about 15 minutes to get himself sorted. Then he left and sneaked out of the Moab and went back to Israel. After Ehud's subsequent victory over the Moabite army, the Israelites enjoyed 80 years of peace. What on earth is this story doing in the Bible? It's just quite obscene, the detail that it goes into. The We then move on to Shagar, and Shagar killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. And that's basically all we know about him. So we go from a graphic explanation of Ehud to this guy killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and that's it. It's really strange. Then we get to Deborah, and she was a prophetess. Her name means busy bee, and she married a man called Flesh, otherwise known as Lepidus in Hebrew. The Midrash, a collection of teachings on the Torah, explains that the Hebrew people are said to be like bees in several ways. One, just as bees follow their leader in a swarm, the Jewish people follow the sages and prophets to teach them. Two, as a bee sting is quite painful, but the bee's honey is incredibly sweet. God's will sting those who don't follow his commands, but will bless those who live righteously with a sweet life. This sort of thing brings out the whole story, I feel. 3, bees collect pollen and nectar, not for their own benefit, but for the benefit of others, just as the Hebrews collect mitzvahs, which is a good deed done for others or religious benefit, for the Lord's pleasure and benefit. And 4, bees are a lowly insect, which is a reminder of God's children to be humble. And Deborah would settle disputes by hearing from the Lord. Deborah would sit under a palm tree between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites would line up for her to rule on matters. Imagine being that awesome at something that you have people lining up and you're just sitting there under a palm tree, and then people tell you their problems and you go, hang about, I'll consult the Lord, and you go into prayer and the answer comes. It's incredible to me. Deborah, the prophetess, was of the tribe of Ephraim, and Barak was her army leader. Deborah's story is notable as she is the only female judge and one of the only female leaders in the entire Tanakh. Her story takes 2 different forms, one of prose in chapter 4 and then a poetic rendering in chapter 5. In both accounts, the Israelites go to war, led by Barak against Jobim of Hazor. Deborah is one of the most influential women in the Bible. She is known for her wisdom and courage, and is the only woman in the Old Testament who is known for her faith and action, not because of her relationship to her husband or another man. As a prophet, Judge Deborah was said to hear God's voice and share God's word with others. As a priestess, she did not offer sacrifices as the men did, but she did lead worship services and preach. Many biblical scholars believe that Deborah was a wife as well. However, in Hebrew, the same word is used for woman and wife, so we don't actually know with certainty if Deborah was a woman of Lapidoth, a place, or the wife of Lapidoth, a person. And it's seen as she's a wife of Lapidoth. Deborah, upon receiving instructions from God, called Barak her Israelite warrior, to bring 10,000 troops to Mount Tabor to attack Sisera, Jabin's commander of troops. Barak responded by saying, "If you won't go with me, I'm not going," essentially. So in the next verse, Deborah agrees to go to battle with Barak and his troops. It is a custom in Israel, in the Israel army, for the senior officer to lead the troops into battle. And because Barak said this, God was angry and said that the enemy of Sisera would become conquered by a woman to humiliate Barak in his cowardice. Deborah and Barak, together with their infantry, climb Mount Tabor and then charge down the side against the Canaan forces, defeating Sisera's force of iron chariots. Sisera himself flees on foot to the tent of a woman named Jael, whose husband, Heber the Kenite, is an ally of Jabin. For unstated reasons, she lets him in. Judge and warrior Deborah went off to battle with Barak, and as foretold in the prophecies, Sisera fell at the hands of a woman. But it wasn't Deborah. Rather, it was Jael, the wife of the clan leader, who would avenge the Israelites. Jael lures the Canaanite general Sisera into her tent, lulls him to sleep with milk, and then Charlie, and then she drives a tent peg through his temple with a mallet. Lovely graphic details. Thus Deborah's prophecy that a woman will defeat Sisera is fulfilled in an unexpected way. Look at the book of Ruth and the story of Moses' birth and upbringing. These two chapters focus on women, Deborah, Jael, and Sisera's mother, and present a female point of view. But unlike those other instances, here we see a woman wielding true military might. Deborah the general and Jael the political assassin. Deborah's a woman who combined stinging rebuke with mellifluous praise in her poetry. In Judges 5, we read Deborah's story again. Hiya, Charlie. I just said that. I don't know why I said it again. We read Deborah's story again, but this time it's in the form of a poem. This chapter of scripture often is referred to as the Song of Deborah. What can we learn from Deborah's story? Deborah and her story can teach us so much, but there are 3 lessons that we can learn. The first is be obedient. If God is telling you to do something or go somewhere, despite your fears, listen to his call. He has plans that we cannot begin to understand, and hearts and lives may be changed by our obedience. The second is be courageous. The old saying, God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called, applies here. Doing something out of our comfort zone to glorify him can be terrifying, but faith was never promised to be easy. Be bold, be courageous for his glory. And it's it always reminds me of the song, "Be bold, be strong, for the Lord your God is with you." And that song was a song of my teenagehood, which is probably ancient now, but it really inspired me to go on in my faith. Be bold, be strong, for the Lord your God is with you. And the third section is stand true. Never waver in your faith. We may not always know the road ahead or what it'll look like, but we only need to remember that God will be faithful and guide us and lead us all the way. When it comes to female biblical role models, Deborah is the heartbeat of this genre, and Deborah is hard to beat. She has it all: intelligence, strength, artistry and prophecy. Interestingly, though, we might argue the Bible has a shortage of strong female leaders. The text evidence no need to apologize for or explain this one who is in many ways far more multi-talented and successful than her male counterparts. And now we move on to Gideon. And compared with some other judges ruling Israel, Gideon seems to get a lot of press in the Old Testament, covering more than 2 chapters, compared with some who only get part of a chapter and 1 or 2 one line. Known as the greatest judge of Israel, readers might be surprised when they dive into the narrative and find a timid ruler. In fact, when we first meet him, he's hiding from his enemies on the threshing floor. Gideon, from the least of the least in terms of tribes, receives a call from God to take on the Midianites, a nomadic and huge group of people who depleted Israel's supplies. Gideon is a fearful man, and we have Gideon portrayed, especially in Sunday schools, as this great conqueror, and he was nothing of the sort. He was a frightened man. The Midianites were capturing any crops produced by the Israelites and seriously giving them grief. When the people of Israel realized the error of their ways, they cried out for help to the Lord. A prophet was sent to deliver them as they had been rescued from Egypt. Enter Gideon. Whilst harvesting wheat and hiding from the Midianites, an angel spoke to him and addressed him as a mighty man of courage. He was nothing of the sort, but God could see into his future, and God could see that he was a mighty man of courage. And quite often what God tells us we are is what we are going to become. But God sees into our future, and God is right. The angel told Gideon that God is sending him to save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. And Gideon must have felt like turning tail and running. When Gideon hears he will save the Israelite people from their oppressors, he doesn't really believe it at first. So he tests God. Not a very sensible thing. It's something that I've done, but it's not a very sensible thing to do. This, right off the bat, seems to contradict the command not to put the Lord your God to test in Deuteronomy 6:16. But Gideon appears to test God a lot. He puts some meat on the altar, fire falls from heaven, not good enough for him. Although at first Gideon doubts his abilities to do so, he is heartened that God will be with him in his mission. The first task he is commanded to fulfill is to destroy the altar of Baal and the Asherah poles. And the Israelites have constructed over time and the evidence of their apostasy. And so during the night, notice during the night, he's not going to go out during the day to do it. He's going to sneak out like a thief in the night and do it at night. Gideon and 10 of his men took down the altar of Baal, making the townspeople very angry and asking for the death of the altar destroyer. Joash, the father of Gideon, then tells them it was Gideon, and if Baal really is a god, he could kill Gideon himself, effectively saving his son. And then he says to the Lord, I need a sign from heaven. First, he requires God to put dew on a fleece he lays out instead of on the ground. Then he asks for the opposite, a dry fleece on a wet ground. Then once more, the opposite. This guy is really trying to get God, in a sense, catch God out. He really wants to make sure. This wasn't the proper thing to do and came from a lack of faith. Nevertheless, God will pull out all the crutches from underneath him and force Gideon to rely on him in the next part of the story. But he had to learn that it's by God's strength and God's strategy that the battles are won. When God wanted Gideon to bring an army to take on the enormous Midianite army, he brings 32,000 men in Judges 7. Although not as sizable as the Midianites, it's enough for Gideon to be comfortable with leading the charge. God has other plans though. He decides to enlist a series of tests of his own on Gideon, reminiscent of the tests Gideon had for him in the previous chapter. First, he makes Gideon send home anyone who is afraid. It turns out that 22,000 of the people in the army have their doubts and head their way home. Now he's left with 10,000. God makes them drink water, and apparently 300 of the men drank water via putting their hands to their mouths. The other 9,700 who knelt to drink are sent home. This is leaving Gideon with 300 men out of 32,000. Gideon knows he has to rely on the Lord to provide a miracle. Gideon must have been terrified at this point, because having an army of 32,000 is still not big enough, as big as the Midianite army, and yet God's whittled this army down to 300. And Gideon must have been thinking, we're just going to get trounced. We're going to get completely murdered. So Gideon would learn here not to put his trust in human resources. But God had an even order plan in place. They won't even have to invade or attack to wipe out the Midianites. He has them create as much noise as possible by blaring trumpets and smashing jars in the night And this confuses the men of the Midianite camp, and they end up killing each other in the chaos. It's amazing what God can do. What can we learn from Gideon's story? God can work with a little bit of faith, and it must have been a minute bit of faith on Gideon's part. Overall, we can learn that God can work through anyone, even timid believers with a little faith. A leader doesn't always mean the boldest and the most extroverted. God often works through believers who come from the least of the least, like Gideon. And we see in the Bible that God takes the least of the least and works through them. When we're hiding from what scares us most, God compels us to tackle it head on. And also, what happens to God? What happens when God wants us to trust him? God doesn't allow metaphorical crutches. Although he plays along with Gideon's fleece test, when it comes to the actual battle, he refuses to let Gideon have a cushion of a bulky army, reducing him to the bare essentials of 300. They know they have to rely on God for a victory, and the same happens in our lives. We can often have various cushions that offer comfort. Maybe we have jobs that provide enough income for a cosy retirement, or other members of the church who step up into leadership roles we'd rather not fill ourselves. We can only hide on the threshing floor for so long before God pulls us up out of our comfort zone and does an amazing work with us. But we've got to allow God to do that. It's no good us constantly relying on the threshing floor and constantly being frightened. Good morning, Brian from Memphis. You must be well asleep at the moment. But we've got to allow God to work in us as well. No matter what the chase, God will reduce our numbers down to 300. When he does so, we have to rely on him to do what we thought was impossible. Then we move on to Jair, and he has 30 sons, 30 donkeys, and a town. And that's all we know about him. Just to give you an idea, Brian, we're talking through Judges, and we are concentrating on Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. The next judge is Japheth. And Japheth comes from an even humbler beginnings as the son of a prostitute. He frees the eastern tribes, Manasseh and Gad, from the oppression of the Ammonites. Though he only ruled for 6 years, one of the more notable stories comes from his reign. Before his battle against the Ammonites, Japheth makes an oath. If you will give me the Ammonites into my hands, then whoever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return victorious from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, to be offered up by me as a burnt offering. Sadly, it was Japheth's daughter who greets him at the door, and thus an unprecedented act of human sacrifice takes place at the hands of the Israelites. Japheth's daughter Japheth's daughter is accepting of what Japheth has done, but she asks for 2 months to go into the hills and party basically with her friends, and then she comes back and sacrifices. Then we move on to Ibzan, and Ibzan had 30 daughters and 30 sons, and all his sons married outside the tribe of Judah, and he belonged to Bethlehem. This family married outside the clan, still inside Israel, but outside the clan, and that's going to come up again in Ruth. So we'll probably cover that next time, or maybe the time after. Then there was Elon, and we know nothing about Elon. Abdon had 40 sons, 30 grandsons, and 70 donkeys. It defies belief that we get the story of Ehud, the story of Japheth, and then we get Abdon, who has 40 sons, 30 grandsons, and 70 donkeys, and that's all we know about him. It's a complete dichotomy of people. And then we come to Samson, whose name was Sunshine, and he was from the tribe of Dan, like Samuel. Samson is one of the most recognizable of the judges who ruled over Israel before the time of the kings. And Samson wasn't all that muscular. We quite often see Samson as this big muscular brute with long flowing hair. Well, we'll find out in a minute why Samson had long flowing hair. But his immense strength just came as a bonus from God. He wasn't a strapping young lad, and that's what made it all the more peculiar that he was so strong. The details of Samson's birth already signify him as a mythical figure. Chapter 13 of Judges tells the story of Manoah and his wife, who is barren. One day an angel of God appears to Manoah's wife, promising that she will bear a son. But this comes with a warning. She cannot contaminate her body with alcohol, because her child will be a Nazarite, dedicated to God from birth. She also learns that her son will save the Israelites from the Philistines. Samson's destiny and his connection to the Philistines is explicitly laid out by God. Even before he is born, the idea of God granting a child in order to dedicate that child to save the Israelites foreshadows a famous birth that appears in the first book of Samuel. There, the prophet Samuel is born to a previously barren woman, and he is dedicated at a young age to serve in the temple. Reared to be set apart as a Nazarite, as a miracle child to an infertile family, Samson seemed to try and break every rule in the book. Before we dive into that, we have to define Nazarite. A Nazarite vow would mean that they could not drink alcohol at all. They could not cut their hair at all, or go near any unclean anything unclean, such as corpses. Now we get into the real story of Samson. Samson was violent and proud, not the sort of things that you expect of a judge of Israel. Samson ignores the rules of his Nazirite vow. He eats honeycomb out of the carcass of a dead lion that he slew. He attends a wedding feast where alcohol is present, although the text does not indicate whether or not he drinks. This article it implies that he sinned during that occasion when he killed 30 Philistines, when his wife Timnah tricks him out of a wager. Whether killing them came from a sound mind or a mind under the influence of alcohol, we don't know. But what we do know is that he sinned. Nazirite. Known for violent acts and a bent for revenge, Samson also ended up committing a number of other atrocities. He ties the tails of 300 foxes together. Can you imagine getting 300 foxes together in one lot, let alone tying the tails of 300 foxes? And he fastens them and sets them ablaze and sets them loose in the Philistine fields. Samson's story skips from his birth to his adulthood, where his first distinguishing act is to ask his father to bring a certain Philistine woman to be his wife. Excuse me. Now, bearing in mind, Samson's parents have been told that he's going to bring down the Philistines, it seems really odd that the first act that he does is to ask for a Philistine for his wife. Samson's parents object, asking him to find a woman amongst the Israelites, but the text justifies Samson's choice, explaining that by marrying a Philistine woman, Samson would have opportunities to infiltrate and fight the Philistines, who were currently the oppressors of Israel. Basically, he found a workaround, and he basically wanted to have sex with this woman, so he found a workaround to marry her. In fact, it is his own way to claim this non-Israelite bride that Samson first discovers his superhuman strength. Suddenly a young lion roared at him. The Spirit of the Lord rushed into him, and he tore the lion apart with his bare hands. Shortly thereafter, he uses his strength to kill 30 Philistine men in a fit of rage, fulfilling the angel's prophecy from the previous chapter. This first act against the Philistines exemplifies Samson's revenge-based vigilantism. The most famous of all Samson's acts against the Philistines comes in chapter 15. The Philistine raid a town in Judah in order to lure and capture Samson. To save themselves, the Judeans tie up Samson to deliver him to his enemies. But this episode does not end well for the Philistines. The Philistines come shouting to meet Samson, and the Spirit of the Lord rushes on him again, and the ropes that were on his arms become like flax that had caught fire, and his bonds melted off him and melted away from his hands. Then he found a jawbone of a donkey, which happened to be lying around. Yeah, probably Judges 13. If you need to check with this, Brian, just put it in the comments after. Then he finds a jawbone of a donkey, reached down and took it, and with it he killed 1,000 men, and that was in Judges 15, verses 14 to 15. Again, Samson leads no army, but acts entirely on his own, fueled by superhuman ability. In spite of his continued directive, hi Constance, or Connie, I remembered. In spite of his continued directive from God to fight the Philistines, Samson pursues a much more personal connection with them. He falls in love with a second Philistine woman, the notorious Delilah, who has been asked by her people to find the secret of Samson's strength. 3 times she begs him for the secret of his strength, and 3 times he lies to her. Finally, after Delilah nagging him persistently, he confesses, "A razor has never come to my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, then my strength would leave me." Sure enough, Delilah takes advantage of this new information, lulling Samson to sleep and shaving off his hair. He immediately weakens and God's power leaves him. Delilah hands Samson over to the Philistines, who gouge out his eyes and force him to grind at the mill in the prison. It's the story of a man who marries and whose wife goes off with his best man, and then he has a run-in with a prostitute whose name is Delilah, and she is his downfall. It's the story of a weak man, not a strong man. He may have been physically strong, but he was weak in will. And after a number of incredible feats of strength, God-given charismatic work, is not his muscle. The Spirit of the Lord departs from him, and he is blind and put to work on a treadmill, and ultimately made a joke of by the Philistines. Samson's death ends up being his greatest victory over the Philistines. The Philistines bring Samson down to Gaza, and they bind him to 2 pillars in their temple as a display of amusement to the Philistine worshippers. Here Samson prays to God, asking for his strength to return to him one more time. God responds by sending Samson a final burst of strength, and Samson pushes against the pillars and brings the entire building down, killing himself and those in the temple with him. The text concludes, those he killed at his death were more than he had killed during his life. So we know that there were over 1,300 Philistines killed there. Samson, in Jewish tradition, the Talmud debates the true character of Samson. One Mishnah paints him in a negative light, saying that Samson's eyes were gouged out as punishment for having followed the desires of his eyes. It is in its discussion, this Mishnah, the Talmud, questions how Samson could punish when God was behind all of his actions in the first place. In the end, the Talmud tries to find a middle ground, that Samson may have followed his own inclinations, but the master plan was God's. His motivation may have been questionable, but Samson was still an important hero at a troubled time for Israel. Samson is the biblical Hercules, a man of superhuman strength who nonetheless could not escape tragedy. Samson's story is found in the book of Judges, chapters 13 to 16. He is the last of the major judges who led the Israelites. But he is hardly the ideal role model or saviour. Samson breaks vows, marries outside the people of Israel twice, and functions more as a vigilante than a leader. Those he killed at his death were more than he killed in his lifetime. We'll finish off about Samson and I'll leave it there. Although the story ends sadly with Samson's death, we can derive several applications from his life. One, we cannot abuse any gifts God has given us. God gifted Samson with incredible strength, but he often abused it, using the might to show off rather than bring glory to God. He learns the hard way that the Lord can give and the Lord can take away at a moment's notice. Sin leads to consequences. Samson didn't see the immediate payout for some of his sin until much later, but it tends to catch up on us at the worst moment, when we feel like acting on impulse, like he had. We need to remind ourselves of the truth of scriptures. We will encounter many Delilahs in the world who will try to find our greatest weakness and exploit it. Even at our lowest, God can still use us. Deprived of all strength and humiliated beyond measure, God returns Samson his strength for one last showdown. Although Samson dies in the process, he ends up killing more of the Israelites than he ever had during his life. And that sort of concludes the story of Samson. There is a poem that I'm gonna leave for next time, and I'll start off with this poem next time. But we'll continue on the story of Judges next time, and we'll, as I said, Judges and Ruth have been split in our Bibles, but they're a combined story. And so we'll continue on through the book of Judges and into the book of Ruth next time. Hope you have a blessed day, and I hope you get to work on time, Brian. And good to speak to you all. And I'll see you next Wednesday at 11. God bless.